When people think of Egypt, they picture pyramids, pharaohs, and mummies. But what if I told you Egypt ruled the medieval world, and almost no one talks about it? Long after the age of the pharaohs, Egypt became the beating heart of global trade. Gold from Africa, spices from India, silk from China, all passed through Cairo. Its cities were richer than most of Europe combined. Its scholars preserved ancient knowledge while new sciences, medicine, and architecture flourished. This was an Egypt of caliphs and sultans, slave soldiers who became kings, and armies that stopped crusaders and Mongols alike. An Egypt that shaped the medieval world and then faded from popular memory. So why was this era forgotten? And how did medieval Egypt rise to power, only to disappear from our history books? This part is Medieval Egypt, the Forgotten Era. From pharaohs to caliphs. How Egypt survived the fall of the ancient world. Egypt did not fall when the ancient world collapsed. It endured, reshaped itself, and quietly carried its past forward beneath new names and new rulers. Like the Nile flowing on while dynasties rose and vanished along its bank. When the last pharaohs faded into history and Roman emperors claimed Egypt as a province, the land did not forget how to be Egypt. Grain still moved downriver, scribes still counted harvests, temples became churches, and the rhythms of the seasons still governed life more than distant capitals ever could. Even as Rome fractured and the Western Empire fell into chaos, Egypt remained an engine of survival for the Mediterranean world, its wheat-feeding cities and armies long after imperial authority weakened. Alexandria, once a beacon of Hellenistic learning, changed hands but not character, becoming a center of Christian theology where debates over faith replaced philosophical schools. Yet the habit of scholarship endured when the Eastern Roman Empire tightened its grip. Egypt grew restless under heavy taxation and religious pressure, its people divided between imperial doctrine and local belief, but still bound together by the Nile and an ancient sense of place older than any empire. Then came the 7th century, when Arab armies crossed into Egypt not as destroyers of civilization, but as inheritors of a land already accustomed to foreign rulers. The conquest was swift, not because Egypt was weak, but because it was pragmatic. Villages negotiated, cities adapted, and administrators shifted languages without dismantling the systems that made the country function. Taxes were still collected, canals still repaired, fields still planted, and Egypt once again became indispensable, this time to a rising Islamic world that stretched far beyond anything Rome had imagined. The old capitals gave way to new ones, and Cairo's earliest foundations rose near earlier settlements. Layers of history stacking rather than replacing one another. Arabic gradually joined and then replaced Greek and Coptic, but the mindset of Egyptian governance, centralized, meticulous, tied to the river, remained unchanged. Where pharaohs once ruled as divine kings and emperors as distant masters, caliphs now governed through governors who quickly learned that Egypt could not be ruled by force alone, only by understanding its land, its people, and its patterns. Egypt became a bridge between worlds. African gold flowed north, Mediterranean goods flowed south, and ideas moved in every direction, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and scholars who found in Egypt a stable heart in an unstable age. The ancient temples, long stripped of their gods, still influenced architecture and spatial thinking, while irrigation techniques developed millennia earlier continued to sustain millions. Christianity did not vanish with the Islamic conquest, nor did older traditions disappear overnight. Instead, Egypt absorbed change as it always had, blending faiths, languages, and identities into something new without erasing the old. Monasteries remained centers of learning, while new mosques rose beside them, both drawing from a shared landscape shaped by centuries of human adaptation. Egypt's survival was not dramatic or loud. It did not announce itself with the collapse of statues or the burning of libraries, but with continuity. Scribes becoming clerks, priests becoming scholars, farmers doing what their ancestors had always done, regardless of who claimed the throne. As the ancient world faded into memory across Europe, Egypt quietly carried fragments of it forward. Administrative knowledge, agricultural science, urban planning, and the very idea that civilization could outlast political ruin. Under the caliphates, Egypt was no relic. It was reborn as a powerhouse of the medieval world, its wealth funding armies, its scholars preserving and expanding knowledge, its cities rivaling any in the known world. The transformation from pharaohs to caliphs was not a rupture, but a long negotiation between past and present, where Egypt proved again that empires come and go, religions rise and change, but the land itself, and the people shaped by it, endure. What survived was not just a country, but a memory encoded in systems, habits, and resilience, allowing Egypt to stand as one of the very few places on earth where the ancient world did not truly die, but simply learned new names, new prayers, and new rulers while remaining unmistakably and enduringly Egypt. The birth of Islamic Egypt was not a single moment of conquest, but a slow, complex transformation shaped as much by continuity as by change, unfolding along the Nile with the quiet persistence that had defined Egyptian history for thousands of years. When Arab forces entered Egypt in the 7th century, under the banner of the rising Islamic world, they did not arrive at a pristine land waiting to be reshaped, but at a province already exhausted by centuries of foreign rule, heavy taxation, and religious conflict under Byzantine authority. Egypt at this time was deeply Christian, yet divided, its population fractured between imperial doctrine and local belief, particularly among Coptic Christians who had long felt marginalized by Constantinople. This internal tension meant that when the armies of the Rashidun Caliphate advanced under the command of Amr ibn al-As, resistance was uneven and often pragmatic rather than ideological, with many local leaders choosing negotiation over destruction in order to preserve their communities and livelihoods. Cities opened their gates not because Egypt lacked strength, but because it had learned through centuries of survival that rulers came and went, while the land and its people remained. The conquest itself was swift by historical standards, yet remarkably restrained, marked more by treaties and administrative adjustments than by wholesale collapse, allowing Egypt's agricultural systems, taxation networks, and local governance to continue functioning with minimal disruption. The Nile still flooded, fields were still planted, and grain still flowed northward, now feeding a new empire whose heart lay in Arabia rather than the Mediterranean. Conversion to Islam, often imagined as sudden or forced, unfolded gradually over generations, shaped by economic incentives, social mobility, and genuine religious conviction rather than coercion, with Christianity remaining a visible and influential presence for centuries after the conquest. Arabic slowly replaced Greek and Coptic as the language of administration, but this linguistic shift masked a deeper continuity. The same bureaucratic mindset, record-keeping habits, and centralized control that had governed Egypt since pharaonic times now served caliphs instead of emperors. New garrison towns emerged, most notably Fustat, not as replacements for Egypt's past, but as additions layered atop it, strategically positioned to control trade, taxation, and communication while remaining deeply dependent on the river that had always defined Egyptian life. Islamic law and governance adapted to local realities, learning quickly that Egypt could not be ruled purely by decree or force, but only by respecting the rhythms of the Nile, the authority of local elites, and the economic importance of agriculture. Mosques rose alongside churches, often drawing on older architectural traditions, while monasteries continued to operate as centers of learning, preserving texts and traditions that would later influence the broader Islamic intellectual world. Egypt's conversion was thus not a story of erasure, but of synthesis, as Islamic belief absorbed and interacted with existing cultural practices, producing a uniquely Egyptian expression of faith that blended Arab, Mediterranean, and African influences. As Egypt became firmly integrated into the Islamic world, its strategic importance only grew, serving as a bridge between continents and a cornerstone of imperial wealth, with its tax revenues funding armies, cities, and scholarship far beyond its borders. The caliphs understood that to control Egypt was to control the lifeblood of empire, and so they invested heavily in its stability, infrastructure, and administration, reinforcing patterns of centralized authority that echoed ancient models even as they were framed in new religious language. Over time, conversion accelerated, not through violence, but through participation, as Egyptians found opportunity and identity within the structures of Islamic society while still carrying forward memories, customs, and local loyalties rooted in a far older past. The birth of Islamic Egypt was therefore less a rupture than a turning of the river's course, subtle yet profound, redirecting the flow of power, culture, and belief, while leaving the underlying terrain intact. In this transformation, Egypt demonstrated once again its extraordinary capacity to endure, to absorb conquerors rather than be consumed by them, and to remain indispensable to every empire that claimed it, proving that along the Nile, history did not simply end and begin anew, but accumulated, layer upon layer, until the ancient world itself lived on within the foundations of a medieval Islamic civilization that was unmistakably Egyptian at its core. The rise of Cairo did not begin with marble palaces or soaring minarets, but with tents pitched on dusty ground beside the Nile, where practicality, geography, and history converged to give birth to one of the greatest cities the medieval world would ever know. In the wake of the Islamic conquest of Egypt, the Arab commander, Amr ibn al-As, chose to found a new administrative center, rather than rule from the ancient and symbolically charged cities of the past. And so Fustat emerged not as a capital of grandeur, but as a city of purpose, positioned near the river, close to trade routes, and free from the political weight of older regimes. Fustat grew organically, shaped less by imperial planning than by the daily needs of soldiers, merchants, scholars, and craftsmen who arrived from across the expanding Islamic world, bringing with them languages, skills, and ambitions that quickly transformed a military encampment into a thriving urban hub. Unlike many cities of antiquity, Fustat was not built on monuments of stone meant to defy time, but on systems, markets, warehouses, mosques, canals, and homes that responded fluidly to population growth and economic demand, allowing it to expand rapidly into a dense and vibrant metropolis. Its streets filled with goods from every corner of the known world, spices from India, gold from sub-Saharan Africa, textiles from the Mediterranean, and ideas carried by travelers who found in Egypt a crossroads unlike any other. As generations passed, Fustat became the beating heart of Islamic Egypt, its wealth flowing directly from the Nile's predictable bounty, which allowed the city to feed itself, sustain large populations, and export surplus grain on a scale unmatched by most medieval cities. Yet Fustat's very success revealed the limits of its informal growth, as fires, overcrowding, and political shifts exposed the need for a more deliberate expression of imperial power. That moment arrived in the 10th century, with the rise of the Fatimid Caliphate, whose leaders envisioned not just a functional capital, but a city that would rival Baghdad and Constantinople in splendor, legitimacy, and ideological authority. North of Fustat, they laid the foundations for a new city, Al-Qahira, the Victorious, designed from the outset as a seat of power, ceremonial order, and religious influence. Its palaces, mosques, and avenues carefully arranged to project dominance and divine favor. Unlike Fustat, Cairo was a statement, a city built to be seen, feared, and admired, yet it never replaced its predecessor so much as absorbed it. creating an urban complex where old and new coexisted in a dynamic, sometimes tense relationship. Over time, the distinction between the two blurred. As markets expanded, populations merged, and infrastructure tied them together into a single sprawling metropolis that dwarfed most European cities of the age in size, wealth, and sophistication. Cairo's rise was fueled not only by imperial ambition, but by its unrivaled position in global trade, as caravans crossed deserts. Ships docked at Red Sea ports, and goods flowed through the city in quantities that astonished contemporary observers. Its markets operated with a complexity that required advanced financial instruments, contracts, and credit systems, while its artisans produced textiles, metalwork, and glass prized across continents. Scholars, drawn by patronage and prestige, turned Cairo into a center of learning where law, theology, medicine, and science flourished, supported by institutions that reflected both Islamic values and older Egyptian traditions of record-keeping and administration. The city's architecture told a story of layered history. Roman columns reused in mosques, ancient urban layouts, guiding new construction, and monumental religious buildings that blended innovation with inherited forms. Even as dynasties changed and political fortunes shifted, Cairo's momentum proved unstoppable, its sheer scale and economic gravity making it indispensable to every ruler who claimed Egypt. Plagues, fires, and floods struck the city repeatedly, yet each time it rebuilt itself, drawing on deep reserves of wealth and human capital that few medieval cities could match. Cairo was not simply large. It was resilient, adaptive, and central. A city whose influence extended far beyond its walls through trade networks, intellectual exchange, and political power. By the high medieval period, travelers spoke of Cairo with awe, describing a city where wealth and poverty, splendor and chaos, devotion and ambition existed side by side, bound together by the Nile and the relentless movement of people and goods. What began as Fustat's practical foundation evolved into a vast urban organism that carried within it the memory of ancient Egypt, the structures of Islamic governance, and the energy of a global crossroads. The rise of Cairo was therefore not a miracle of sudden creation, but the culmination of centuries of continuity and adaptation, proving that the greatest medieval city in the world was built not by erasing the past, but by stacking it layer upon layer until history itself became the city's foundation. Medieval Egypt stood at the center of the world, not because it conquered vast territories, but because the world came to it, drawn irresistibly by geography, infrastructure, and a trading culture refined over thousands of years, making the Nile Valley the single most important commercial crossroads of the medieval age. Long before global trade had a name, Egypt functioned as its engine, linking sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean, the Indian Ocean to Europe, and the Islamic world to lands far beyond its borders, transforming raw geography into organized exchange on a scale few societies could rival. Gold flowed north from the African interior along caravan routes that terminated in Egypt, where merchants refined, taxed, and redistributed it across the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern worlds, financing empires, armies, and monumental architecture from Cairo to Constantinople. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and cardamom arrived from India and Southeast Asia via the Red Sea, carried by sailors who understood monsoon winds, and by traders who trusted Egyptian ports as reliable gateways between oceans. Silk traveled west from China through Central Asia or south by sea, passing through Egyptian markets where it was inspected, taxed, repackaged, and sent onward to Europe, where it became a symbol of wealth and power unimaginable without Egypt's mediation. This trade did not happen by accident. It depended on Egypt's mastery of logistics, its ability to move goods efficiently between river, desert, and sea, using canals, warehouses, customs offices, and standardized systems of taxation that echoed administrative traditions reaching back to pharaonic times. Cairo and its predecessor cities became vast commercial organisms, their markets humming with dozens of languages, their docks crowded with ships, and their caravanserais packed with merchants whose fortunes rose and fell with the flow of goods. Under the Fatimid Caliphate and later regimes, the state actively protected and regulated trade, understanding that Egypt's true power lay not only in armies but in commerce, and that controlling choke points mattered more than controlling territory. The Nile functioned as the backbone of this system, its predictable floods ensuring agricultural surplus that fed urban populations and freed labor for crafts, transport, and finance, while also allowing Egypt to export grain in enormous quantities, particularly during European famines when Egyptian wheat could mean the difference between survival and collapse for distant cities. Merchants in medieval Egypt operated within sophisticated financial networks, using contracts, credit, partnerships, and early forms of banking that allowed capital to move faster and farther than physical goods, multiplying wealth and tying Egypt even more tightly into global systems. The Red Sea ports connected Egypt directly to the Indian Ocean world, while Mediterranean harbors linked it to Europe and North Africa, turning the country into a hinge between civilizations that often knew little of one another, except through Egyptian intermediaries. Ideas traveled with goods, as mathematical concepts, medical knowledge, religious thought, and artistic styles passed through Egypt's cities, absorbed, transformed, and transmitted onward, making trade a vehicle for cultural exchange as much as economic profit. Egyptian craftsmen added value to imported materials, weaving textiles, shaping metalwork, and producing luxury goods that were themselves exported, further reinforcing the country's centrality in global markets. This prosperity attracted migrants, scholars, and entrepreneurs, swelling cities and reinforcing Egypt's reputation as a land of opportunity, even as it deepened social inequalities and made urban life intensely competitive. Rulers rose and fell, dynasties changed, and political crises erupted, but trade endured, adapting to new circumstances with remarkable resilience, because the underlying logic of Egypt's position could not be altered without rewriting geography itself. Even plagues and wars, devastating as they were, failed to permanently disrupt Egypt's commercial role, as demand for gold, spices, and silk always returned, pulling the country back into the heart of global exchange. European states, Islamic empires, and Asian powers all depended on Egypt in ways they rarely acknowledged, relying on its markets to access goods they could not obtain directly. By the late medieval period, this centrality made Egypt both immensely wealthy and strategically vulnerable, a prize coveted by those who understood that to control Egypt was to control the arteries of world trade. Yet, for centuries, Egypt balanced this power with stability, proving that its greatest strength lay not in conquest but in connection. Gold, spices, and silk were more than commodities. They were symbols of a world bound together by roots that converged on the Nile, making medieval Egypt not a peripheral land remembered only for its ancient past, but the living heart of a global economy long before the modern age imagined itself connected. The Fatimid Revolution was not merely a change of rulers in Egypt, but a seismic shift in the political, religious, and cultural balance of the medieval world. A moment when Cairo emerged as the capital of a rival vision of Islam that challenged the authority of empires stretching from Baghdad to the western Mediterranean. In the 10th century, as the Abbasid caliphs in the east struggled with internal decay and fragmented power, the Fatimid Caliphate rose from North Africa with an audacious claim that they alone were the true caliphs, descended from the Prophet's family and destined to lead the Islamic world. Their conquest of Egypt was calculated rather than chaotic, recognizing that whoever controlled the Nile controlled wealth, food, and legitimacy. And when Fatimid armies entered the country, They encountered a society already accustomed to shifting masters, but keenly aware of Egypt's own importance. Rather than ruling from existing cities weighed down by past regimes, the Fatimids founded a new capital, Cairo, deliberately designed as a symbol of triumph and divine favor, its very name proclaiming victory, its walls enclosing palaces, ceremonial avenues, and spaces of power meant to rival any capital in the world. From this city, the Fatimid Caliphs ruled not just as political leaders but as spiritual figures, promoting Ismaili Shi'ism through an unprecedented campaign of education, ritual, and public spectacle that turned ideology into lived experience. Cairo became a stage on which power was performed daily, with processions, festivals, and court rituals that fused religious symbolism with imperial authority, impressing both supporters and skeptics with the confidence of a regime that believed history was on its side. Central to this vision was the founding of institutions that blended faith and knowledge, most famously Al-Azhar, established not only as a mosque, but as a center for teaching Fatimid doctrine, sending trained missionaries across the Islamic world to spread their message from Yemen to Persia. Yet the Fatimid revolution was not sustained by ideology alone. It rested on a sophisticated understanding of governance, commerce, and inclusion that allowed a Shia dynasty to rule a largely Sunni and Christian population without constant rebellion. Rather than enforcing conversion, the Fatimids practiced a pragmatic tolerance, employing Christians, Jews, and Sunnis in administration, protecting trade networks, and ensuring that Egypt's agricultural and commercial systems continued to thrive. This approach transformed Cairo into a magnet for merchants, scholars, and artisans, swelling its population and wealth while reinforcing its status as a global capital. Under Fatimid rule, Egypt became the hub of an empire that stretched across the Mediterranean and deep into the Red Sea world, its navy protecting trade routes, its treasuries filled with revenue drawn from gold, spices, textiles, and taxes flowing along routes that converged on the Nile. The Fatimid court dazzled contemporaries with its luxury and learning, amassing libraries said to contain hundreds of thousands of volumes and patronizing scholars whose work shaped theology, philosophy, and science. Yet beneath this brilliance lay constant tension, as the very claim that legitimized the Fatimids also isolated them, provoking hostility from Sunni powers, who viewed Cairo not just as a political rival, but as an ideological threat. Internal divisions, succession disputes, and economic pressures gradually weakened the regime, even as Cairo itself continued to grow in size and influence. By the time Fatimid power declined, the revolution they had sparked could not be undone. They had permanently shifted the center of gravity of the Islamic world westward, proving that Baghdad was no longer the uncontested heart of empire. More importantly, they had built Cairo into a capital whose infrastructure, institutions, and prestige would outlive them, ready to be inherited by future dynasties who might reject Fatimid beliefs but eagerly claim Fatimid foundations. The Fatimid revolution thus stands as one of history's great paradoxes, a rival caliphate that ultimately failed to unite the Islamic world under its banner, yet succeeded beyond measure in reshaping Egypt's destiny, transforming Cairo from a new city into a permanent center of power, culture, and ambition, and demonstrating that revolutions are remembered not only by the ideas they promote, but by the cities they leave behind. Medieval Egypt became one of humanity's great intellectual lifeboats at a time when much of the ancient world's knowledge stood on the brink of disappearance. Not through a single golden age or one legendary library, but through centuries of accumulated effort in which scholars, scribes, translators, administrators, and patrons treated learning as both a sacred duty and a practical necessity of civilization. Long after the fall of classical institutions in Western Europe, Egypt inherited overlapping traditions of knowledge from pharaonic record-keeping, Hellenistic scholarship, Roman administration, Christian monasticism, and Islamic intellectual culture. weaving them together into a living system that valued preservation as much as innovation. Monasteries along the Nile, especially among Coptic communities, quietly safeguarded texts in Greek and Coptic during the turbulent centuries of late antiquity, copying works of theology, medicine, astronomy, and philosophy while adapting them to new religious frameworks. When Islamic rule took root, these existing traditions did not vanish. Instead, they were absorbed into a broader scholarly culture that prized literacy, debate, and the written word, viewing knowledge as a means to understand both God's creation and the mechanics of governance. Egypt's cities, especially Cairo and Fustat, became magnets for scholars from across the Islamic world, drawn by patronage, stability, and access to books flowing in from every direction. Greek works preserved in the Eastern Mediterranean, Persian administrative manuals, Indian mathematical ideas, and Arabic poetry and theology that flourished alongside them. Under the Fatimid Caliphate, learning became a tool of statecraft as well as faith, with rulers investing heavily in libraries, teaching institutions, and public lectures designed to educate elites and impress rivals, transforming Cairo into one of the most intellectually vibrant cities on earth. Fatimid libraries were legendary in scale and ambition, reportedly containing hundreds of thousands of volumes at a time, when even wealthy European monasteries might possess only dozens. And these collections were not locked away as symbols of prestige, but actively used by scholars who copied, commented upon, and challenged the texts they encountered. Knowledge in medieval Egypt was not static. It was argued over in mosques, discussed in markets, and refined in teaching circles, where students memorized, debated, and transmitted ideas orally as much as in writing, ensuring that learning could survive even when books were lost to fire, flood, or political upheaval. The founding of Al-Azhar marked a turning point in the institutionalization of learning, creating a space where religious study, law, language, and eventually philosophy and science could be taught systematically, producing generations of scholars whose influence extended far beyond Egypt's borders. Although initially aligned with Fatimid ideology, Al-Azhar outlived the dynasty that created it, adapting its mission and curriculum as political power shifted, demonstrating one of medieval Egypt's defining strengths: its ability to preserve institutions even as rulers changed. Egyptian scholars played a crucial role in translating and interpreting ancient Greek works on medicine, astronomy, and logic, not merely preserving them, but expanding upon them through observation, experimentation, and commentary, ensuring that these ideas evolved rather than fossilized. Medical knowledge flourished in Egypt's hospitals, where physicians combined classical theory with practical experience, writing manuals that circulated widely and shaped healthcare across the Islamic world, and, later, Europe. Mathematics and astronomy benefited from Egypt's geographic position and administrative needs, as precise calculations were essential for taxation, architecture, irrigation, and determining religious calendars, turning abstract knowledge into applied science deeply embedded in daily life. Paper production and bookmaking thrived in Cairo's markets, lowering the cost of books and democratizing access to learning in ways that parchment-based cultures struggled to match, while professional scribes and book dealers formed a recognizable intellectual economy that linked scholarship to commerce. Jewish and Christian scholars participated actively in this environment, translating texts between languages and contributing to debates that crossed religious boundaries, proving that medieval Egyptian learning was pluralistic by necessity as much as by choice. Even during periods of crisis, plague, famine, political instability, Egypt's scholarly culture showed remarkable resilience as students continued to study, teachers continued to lecture, and books continued to circulate, sometimes in private homes when public institutions faltered. Ironically, much of what the modern world knows about ancient Greece, Rome, and the early sciences survived not because Europe preserved its own past, but because Egypt and the wider Islamic world valued that past enough to protect, reinterpret, and transmit it forward. When later European scholars encountered classical knowledge during the Renaissance, they often did so through Arabic texts that had passed through Egyptian hands, carrying layers of commentary that shaped how that knowledge would be understood anew. Yet medieval Egypt was not merely a guardian of old ideas, it was a generator of new ones, producing original thought in law, theology, linguistics, medicine, and philosophy that addressed the realities of a complex, multicultural society. Knowledge in Egypt was never abstracted from life. It was tied to governance, faith, trade, and survival along the Nile, ensuring that learning remained relevant and supported by the state and society alike. The tragedy of lost knowledge is therefore only partially true, for while many individual works vanished to time, war, or neglect, the intellectual spirit that valued preservation and inquiry endured, passing from generation to generation through institutions, habits, and cultural expectations. Medieval Egypt preserved human learning not by freezing the ancient world in amber, but by allowing it to breathe, adapt, and grow within new civilizations, proving that the survival of knowledge depends less on single libraries or legendary scholars, and more on societies willing to invest in memory, debate, and the patient work of teaching, copying, and questioning. An inheritance that would shape the world long after the medieval age itself had faded into history. Few stories in world history are as startling and paradoxical as the rise of the Mamluks, men who began their lives as enslaved outsiders, yet ended up ruling Egypt as warrior kings, reshaping the medieval Islamic world through discipline, ambition, and relentless military power. The Mamluk system emerged from a pragmatic logic that had long existed in Islamic states. Rulers needed soldiers whose loyalty lay not with family, tribe, or local elites, but solely with their master and the state. And so young boys, often Turks, Circassians, or Central Asians, were purchased, converted to Islam, trained intensively in warfare, and forged into elite cavalrymen, bound by brotherhood and obedience. In Egypt, this system reached its most dramatic expression, as generations of Mamluks grew not merely into soldiers, but into a self-aware military class, conscious of its strength, cohesion, and indispensability. Initially serving under the Ayyubid rulers who followed Saladin, the Mamluks became the backbone of Egypt's army, defending the country against Crusaders and internal rivals alike, while quietly accumulating power within the state. Their rise accelerated during moments of crisis, when the old political order faltered and military competence mattered more than noble lineage, culminating in a dramatic seizure of power in the mid-13th century that gave birth to the Mamluk Sultanate. What made this new regime extraordinary was not merely that former slaves ruled a major empire, but that slavery itself became the gateway to sovereignty, as only those trained through the Mamluk system could truly belong to the ruling elite. Succession followed no simple bloodline. Instead, power flowed through skill, alliances, and military reputation, creating a brutal yet dynamic political culture in which rulers had to constantly prove themselves worthy of command. Cairo became the stage on which this unique experiment in power unfolded, its citadel filled with intrigue, rivalry, and ceremony as sultans rose and fell with startling speed, sometimes assassinated, sometimes overthrown, sometimes dying peacefully after decades of rule. Despite this instability at the top, the state itself proved remarkably resilient, because the Mamluk system continuously reproduced trained warriors and administrators who shared a common identity and interest in preserving their collective dominance. The greatest test of Mamluk legitimacy came when the Mongols, seemingly unstoppable after destroying Baghdad, advanced toward the heart of the Islamic world, threatening to erase centuries of civilization in a single wave of conquest. It was under leaders like Baybars that the Mamluks achieved their defining victory, halting the Mongol advance and positioning themselves as the defenders of Islam, a role that granted them immense prestige and moral authority across the region. This military success transformed former slaves into symbols of salvation, rewriting social hierarchies and demonstrating that power in medieval Egypt was earned through the sword as much as inherited through blood. The Mamluks also dismantled the last Crusader strongholds along the eastern Mediterranean, ending centuries of foreign Christian rule and reinforcing Egypt's status as the dominant power of the Eastern Islamic world. Yet their rule was not solely martial. The Mamluks invested heavily in architecture, law, and urban life, covering Cairo with mosques, madrasas, hospitals, and mausoleums that proclaimed both piety and permanence, even as individual rulers remained acutely aware of how fragile their own positions were. Wealth drawn from trade, taxation, and control of pilgrimage routes funded these projects, binding religious devotion, economic power, and political legitimacy into a single visual language of stone and marble. Socially, the Mamluk order remained closed and exclusive, carefully reproducing itself by importing new slaves, rather than integrating local populations, ensuring that the ruling class always remained foreign-born and distinct from the society it governed. This separation created tension but also stability, as the Mamluks ruled not as representatives of any ethnic group, but as guardians of a state they believed only they were trained to protect. Over time, their rigid system began to show cracks, as internal rivalries intensified, military technology evolved, and economic pressures mounted. Yet for more than 2 centuries, the Mamluks defied expectations, ruling one of the richest and most strategic regions of the medieval world, without dynastic legitimacy or ancestral claims. Their story challenges modern assumptions about power, freedom, and social mobility, revealing a world in which enslavement could paradoxically become a path to authority, and where identity was forged not by birth, but by training, loyalty, and violence. The rise of the Mamluks stands as a reminder that medieval Egypt was not governed by static traditions, but by adaptive systems capable of producing entirely new forms of rule, proving that history's most unlikely actors, slaves torn from distant lands, could become kings who shaped the fate of empires. In the medieval imagination of both friend and foe, Egypt came to be seen not merely as a rich land of rivers and cities, but as the final shield standing between civilization and catastrophe, a place whose armies bore the weight of invasions that threatened to tear the Islamic world apart. For centuries, waves of external enemies crashed against its frontiers, none more dangerous than the Crusaders from the west and the Mongols from the east. 2 forces driven by radically different visions, yet equally capable of destruction on a scale the medieval world had never known. The Crusader threat emerged first, as European armies carved out fortified states along the eastern Mediterranean, turning the Levant into a battlefield where faith, ambition, and survival collided. Egypt quickly realized that these foreign enclaves were not distant nuisances, but existential dangers capable of strangling trade routes, threatening pilgrimage paths, and serving as launching points for deeper invasions. Control of Egypt meant control of grain, wealth, and manpower, and so the Crusaders repeatedly dreamed of taking the Nile Valley itself, knowing that without Egypt, the Islamic Near East could not endure. In response, Egyptian rulers transformed the country into a military powerhouse, mobilizing resources, refining command structures, and projecting power northward to keep the Crusader states divided and vulnerable. This struggle reached its height under leaders like Saladin, whose consolidation of Egypt and Syria marked a turning point, shifting the balance of power and framing Egypt as the strategic heart of resistance. Over decades of warfare, Egyptian-led armies dismantled Crusader strongholds one by one, not through reckless assaults but through calculated campaigns that combined diplomacy, siegecraft, and economic pressure, ultimately ending nearly 2 centuries of foreign Christian rule along the coast. Yet even as the Crusader threat waned, a far greater storm gathered on the horizon, one that dwarfed anything the medieval world had previously faced. The rise of the Mongol Empire unleashed an unparalleled wave of conquest, annihilating cities, massacring populations, and obliterating political systems from China to Eastern Europe. When the Mongols destroyed Baghdad in 1258, killing the Abbasid Caliph and shattering the symbolic heart of the Islamic world, terror spread faster than armies, as rumors of invincibility and total annihilation preceded them. Egypt suddenly found itself standing alone, the last major power capable of resisting a force that seemed unstoppable, and the responsibility was immense. If Egypt fell, there would be no barrier left between the Mongols and North Africa, Arabia, and the holy cities of Islam. Under the banner of the Mamluk Sultanate, Egypt responded with urgency and resolve, mobilizing its elite cavalry, tightening discipline, and framing resistance as both a political necessity and a religious duty. The confrontation that followed was not just a battle of armies, but a clash of worldviews, pitting the Mongols' reputation for terror and speed against the Mamluks' cohesion, training, and intimate knowledge of the land. At a critical moment, Egyptian forces met the Mongols in open battle and did what no other army had yet accomplished. They stopped them. The victory shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility, sending shockwaves across Eurasia and restoring confidence to a world that had begun to believe resistance was futile. From that moment on, Egypt was no longer just a regional power. It was the defender of a civilization, the place where annihilation had been turned back by human will and military skill. This role reshaped Egypt's identity, as rulers presented themselves not merely as kings or sultans, but as guardians of the faith and protectors of the wider Islamic community, drawing legitimacy from the blood spilled on distant battlefields. The military demands of this role transformed Egyptian society, reinforcing the dominance of the warrior elite, channeling vast resources into fortifications, training and arms, and turning Cairo into a command center from which campaigns were planned and victories celebrated. Egypt's cities bore the marks of this age of defense, with citadels rising above urban skylines and mosques commemorating triumphs over enemies once thought unstoppable. Yet the cost of being the shield was high, as constant mobilization strained the economy, concentrated power in military hands, and normalized violence as a tool of governance. Still, for generations, Egypt held the line, ensuring that trade routes remained open, pilgrimage continued, and the intellectual and cultural life of the Islamic world survived intact. In doing so, it preserved not only territories but traditions, allowing scholarship, commerce, and faith to endure in a world repeatedly threatened by collapse. The story of Egypt against Crusaders and Mongols is therefore not simply one of battles won, but of a civilization choosing to stand its ground when retreat meant extinction, proving that geography alone does not make a shield. People do, and that along the Nile, the fate of the medieval Islamic world was decided not by inevitability but by resistance. The power of medieval Egypt did not collapse in a single dramatic conquest or revolution, but fractured slowly under the weight of catastrophe, and nothing exposed those fractures more brutally than the arrival of the Black Death, a disaster that struck at the very foundations of a society built on people, labor, and constant motion. When plague swept into Egypt in the mid-14th century, carried along the same trade routes that had once brought wealth and prosperity, it tore through cities and villages with a speed and ferocity that defied explanation, emptying neighborhoods, silencing markets, and turning bustling urban centers into landscapes of fear and mourning. Cairo, once overflowing with life, scholarship, and commerce, became a city of funerals, as carts piled high with bodies moved through streets where prayer and panic blended into a single, unending sound. The Nile still flooded and the seasons still turned, but the human systems that had sustained Egypt's dominance for centuries began to fail, as farmers died in the fields, artisans vanished from workshops, and the intricate balance between countryside and city collapsed. The demographic shock was immense, wiping out a staggering portion of the population in repeated waves that returned generation after generation, ensuring that recovery was never complete, but always fragile and incomplete. For a state like the Mamluk Sultanate, whose strength rested on a constant supply of trained soldiers, administrators, and taxable labor, the consequences were devastating, undermining both military readiness and economic stability. The Mamluk system, already strained by internal rivalries and rapid turnover of rulers, struggled to replace lost manpower, forcing the state to extract more from fewer people, raising taxes and tightening control in ways that bred resentment and further weakened productivity. Trade networks that had once pulsed through Egypt slowed dramatically, as fear of contagion disrupted travel and reduced demand, cutting into the revenues that had funded armies, architecture, and patronage of learning. Entire professions vanished in some areas, taking with them skills and institutional memory that could not easily be rebuilt, while abandoned land reverted to wilderness, reducing agricultural output and eroding the tax base even further. Politically, the plague intensified existing tensions, as frequent deaths among elites led to rapid successions, contested authority, and a sense that power was temporary and precarious, encouraging short-term extraction rather than long-term investment. Rulers responded by building monuments and asserting authority through spectacle. But these gestures could not mask the deeper reality that the state's foundations were eroding beneath the surface. Social trust fractured as communities searched for explanations, sometimes blaming minorities, outsiders, or moral decay, while religious responses oscillated between fatalism and reform, with scholars debating whether the plague was divine punishment, a test of faith, or a natural phenomenon beyond human control. Despite moments of resilience, Egypt could not fully escape the cumulative damage, as each new outbreak struck a society already weakened by the last, preventing demographic recovery and locking the economy into a cycle of contraction. The very systems that had once made Egypt powerful, dense urban life, constant movement of goods and people, and integration into global trade, now amplified vulnerability, turning strength into liability. Over time, military effectiveness declined as resources shrank, technological innovation slowed, and rival powers began to bypass or challenge Egypt's control of trade routes, further reducing its strategic importance. By the time new global dynamics emerged, Egypt found itself less able to adapt, weighed down by institutions designed for a world that no longer existed. The decline was not total collapse, but a long fading, marked by shrinking horizons and diminished influence, as Cairo remained impressive, yet no longer unmatched. And Egypt continued to matter, but no longer defined the fate of regions beyond its borders. The Black Death did not destroy Egypt outright. It revealed its limits, exposing how deeply power depends on human life, and how fragile even the greatest systems become when that life is cut away. Plague cracked the empire open, allowing economic weakness, political instability, and external pressures to seep in, ensuring that medieval Egypt's era of unquestioned dominance would not return. Yet even in decline, Egypt endured, adapting once again to a harsher world, carrying forward the memory of a time when it had stood at the center of global civilization, and reminding history that empires rarely fall only by the sword. Sometimes they are undone by silence, absence, and the slow, invisible work of disease. Medieval Egypt did not disappear because it suddenly became unimportant, but because the world learned to remember history in ways that quietly pushed it aside, reshaping the past to fit new narratives of progress, power, and identity that no longer centered the Nile. For centuries, Egypt had been one of the great engines of civilization, commanding trade routes, shaping intellectual life, and deciding the fate of empires. Yet as the medieval world gave way to the early modern age, its story slipped into the margins. overshadowed by new powers and new ways of telling history. One reason was political transition. When Egypt was absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, it lost formal independence and became, in European eyes especially, a province rather than a protagonist, its achievements increasingly attributed to imperial systems rather than local initiative. Cairo remained vast, wealthy, and culturally alive, but it was no longer the seat of a rival caliphate or a military shield against global threats, and historians accustomed to framing history around sovereign states and dramatic conquests found it easier to focus elsewhere. At the same time, global trade patterns shifted, as new maritime routes around Africa allowed European powers to bypass Egypt's long dominant role as middleman between East and West, draining the economic centrality that had once made the country impossible to ignore. As gold, spices, and silk flowed increasingly through Atlantic and Indian Ocean routes, controlled by European navies, Egypt's position as the hinge of world commerce weakened, and with it the perception of its global importance. Intellectual history followed a similar path, as the European Renaissance rebranded the recovery of classical knowledge as a European achievement, often downplaying or erasing the centuries during which that knowledge had been preserved, expanded, and transmitted through the Islamic world, including Egypt. Texts that had passed through Cairo's scholars were retranslated into Latin, stripped of their Arabic commentaries, and presented as rediscoveries rather than inheritances, subtly reframing medieval Egypt from a source of knowledge into a mere conduit, and eventually into a footnote. Orientalist attitudes that emerged in later centuries further distorted the picture, portraying the Islamic Middle Ages as static or decadent, incapable of innovation, and thus unworthy of the same narrative attention granted to ancient Greece or modern Europe. Egypt suffered especially from this framing, because its ancient past loomed so large that it eclipsed everything that came after, encouraging a story in which the land of the pharaohs mysteriously fell asleep for 1,000 years before awakening again in the modern era. Pyramids, mummies, and hieroglyphs captured imaginations, while medieval Cairo, with its markets, scholars, armies, and institutions, was treated as an interlude rather than a defining chapter. Language barriers reinforced this amnesia, as fewer modern historians could read Arabic sources compared to Greek or Latin ones, narrowing the archive from which global history was written, and privileging perspectives that naturally emphasized European experiences. Even within Egypt, layers of conquest and colonialism reshaped education and identity, encouraging narratives that aligned with modern nation-states or ancient glory, rather than the complex multicultural realities of the medieval period. The very resilience that had defined medieval Egypt, its ability to adapt, absorb new rulers, and continue functioning, worked against its memory because it left no single dramatic fall that demanded explanation, no sudden catastrophe that marked an unmistakable end. Instead, Egypt faded gradually from the center of global affairs, remaining important locally and regionally, while the world's attention shifted westward and outward. When modern history textbooks took shape in Europe and later spread globally, they followed the paths of empire and industry, tracing lines from ancient Greece to Rome to medieval Europe to the modern West, with Egypt's medieval centuries awkwardly placed outside this progression. What did not fit the story was often omitted, simplified, or ignored, and so medieval Egypt, which did not neatly serve as an origin story for modern Europe, was left behind. Yet its disappearance from history books does not reflect a lack of significance, but a failure of perspective, a reminder that history is not only about what happened, but about who decides what matters. Medieval Egypt mattered profoundly. It fed continents, stopped invasions, housed scholars, moved ideas, and sustained one of the world's greatest cities for centuries. Its legacy lives on invisibly, embedded in global trade systems, legal traditions, scientific knowledge, and urban life, even when its name is absent from the page. To recover medieval Egypt is therefore not to add a forgotten chapter to history, but to rewrite the structure of the story itself, recognizing that the path from the ancient world to the modern one did not run only through Europe, but flowed powerfully along the Nile, through Cairo's streets and libraries, carried by people whose achievements shaped the world, even as the world slowly forgot their names.
Please subscribe the channel and press the bell button to get more interesting stories.